Well, I can't believe you're still alive. I'm a grandpa now and couldn't be happier. My dad laughed crudely, looking at my mom. After abandoning us, my dad went on to marry his mistress. Now, he has a son and recently even became a grandpa. He proudly introduces his own family. Then, he starts boasting about how great his life has been since leaving my mom. On the other hand, you're living in this shabby hotel and working part-time LOL. What a miserable sight. He's still mocking us, as usual. It's been a while. I glare at my dad sharply. He looks surprised. Oh, are you Margaret? Wow, what a sight. You two working together in this run-down hotel, getting along. Probably had to borrow money to cover medical bills. It must be tough life paying off debts. Drunk or not, he keeps spouting off his wild imagination. Feeling fed up, I was about to retort when my mom calmly interjected. Margaret, no, remember, they are guests. Hey, what are you whispering about over there? Ignoring his heckling, my mom firmly faces forward. And then, she declares boldly, I'll introduce our family, which has been running a business for 17 years. My dad's face froze in astonishment. Then, as my mom recounted the facts, he lost all expression. My name is Margaret Turner. I just turned 20 recently. While most people my age are still students, I'm already working. Every day, I wake up at 5 a.m. and head to work. I work at a hotel. Country Hotel, that's the name of the hotel I work at. Right now, it's the busy season, so Country Hotel is no exception. It's busy every day. After taking over from the night shift staff, I quickly get through my morning tasks. My mom, Maria, arrived soon after. How's it going today? Yay, it's busy but I'm managing. I reply with a smile. Actually, my mom works at the same hotel. Because she had a serious illness in the past, she decided not to work long hours. I'm glad that I can help my mom by working here together. As noon approaches, more guests arrive to check in. I head to the reception. One by one, they completed the procedures, and then a family of 3 arrived. They seemed like a lovely family. Watching them, I feel a pang in my heart. Because my dad isn't here. My parents divorced when I was young. I hardly remember my dad. But from my mom and grandparents' repeated stories, I know what kind of person he was. Apparently, he was terrible. What he did to our family is unforgivable. That was when I was young. I lived with my dad and sickly mom. My mom had been unwell since I was born, spending a lot of time lying in bed. I'm sorry, Margaret. I couldn't do anything that a mother should. I remember my mom saying that with tears in her eyes. During those days, her condition gradually worsened. Her illness was considered incurable at the time, so the prognosis was very poor. By the time I was 3 years old, her condition had deteriorated to the point where her life expectancy was declared. Well, there's nothing we can do. I know my own body best. My mom had been a nurse when she was single. Perhaps because she had seen the fate of people suffering from the same illness, she seemed prepared for the worst. In such circumstances, my dad abandoned my mom. In fact, he had a mistress. My mom didn't like to talk about it much, but my grandparents told me instead. While nursing my mom, my dad started going out to nightclubs to relieve stress. It was at one of those places he frequented that he found his favorite woman. My dad abandoned mom and chose that woman. The divorce was quietly settled without my knowledge. And on the day my dad left the house, it seemed I clung to my dad and wouldn't let go. Even though I was young, I must have sensed something. But my dad forcibly pushed me away and yelled, "Get out of the way." I started crying. "Margaret, I'm not your father from today. You two just have to cling to each other and live in this miserable house." My dad smirked. "How could you say such things to Margaret?" My mom hugged me protectively. Then, my dad, with a demonic expression, spat out, "I'm tired of nursing you. I want to be free. Don't blame me. If you want to blame someone, blame your illness." And my dad left the house without looking back. My mom held me tightly without moving. We cried quietly. It's a horrible story. If it were me now, I would have spat on my dad. But back then, as a 3-year-old, there was nothing I could do. My mom and I were at a loss. After that, we ended up living with my maternal grandparents. It was difficult for my mom, who was often bedridden due to illness, and me, who was not even 3 years old, to live satisfactorily. Fortunately, my grandparents took care of both my mom's nursing and me. There's nothing but gratitude for that. However, my mom's condition remained unchanged. The only possibility of recovery lay in the latest treatment. However, it required a large sum of money to undergo it. There was no way my grandparents, who lived on a pension, could afford such money. If only we had some savings. Haven't you been saving? We do have some family savings. But that money is for Margaret's education. The conversation was repeated countless times. I somehow understood that my mom couldn't use the money for my sake. Finally, I couldn't bear it and spoke up. Mom, I'm okay. Use the money for your treatment. When I grow up, I'll take care of myself. More than that, I want you to get better. I spoke while crying. My mom initially refused, but after repeated persuasion from me and my grandparents, she finally seemed willing to use the savings. School isn't important. If my mom gets better, that's all that matters. Money can be sorted out somehow. I think I said something like that. And so, instead of my bedridden mom, my grandmother went to withdraw money from the family account. However, we faced an unexpected situation. It turned out that the family savings my mom had diligently saved up were completely gone. The only other person who knew the PIN for this account was my dad. It was unimaginable that anyone else but my dad had withdrawn the money. We were devastated. Just when we finally saw a glimmer of hope, once again, my dad's presence deprived us of our future. Even if we wanted to get it back, my dad had disappeared with his mistress, and we didn't even know how to contact him. We filed a police report, but his whereabouts remained unknown. What were we supposed to do? It was a time when everyone was troubled. My mother received a message from a man. He claimed to be an acquaintance of hers. He had been hospitalized at the hospital where my mom worked as a nurse after a serious accident in the past. It was a terrible accident, and the man suffered significant after effects. He had been depressed for a while and had completely shut himself off. However, with my mom's earnest encouragement, he managed to recover. After that, the man regained his will to live, started his own business. He achieved huge success. And even after being discharged from the hospital, he kept in touch with my mom about once a year, updating her on his current situation. When my mom talked about her situation this time, he offered to pay for her medical expenses. We were surprised. Initially, my mom refused. However, the man was adamant, saying, "Please let me pay." He said, "I want to repay the favor since I was able to recover because of you." Still, my mom stubbornly refused. But the man wouldn't give up and said, "In that case, instead of paying for the treatment, there's something I'd like you to do for me." When my mom heard what it was, she hesitated. It seemed she was anxious about whether she could do it herself. But the man said, "You can do it." With those words, my mom decided to accept his offer. For us, this event was like a bolt from the blue. My mom, who had seemed to have no hope, was able to receive treatment. There was nothing happier than this. But of course, she didn't recover immediately. It took some time and effort to restore her to her original condition. She had to take a large amount of medication and go to the hospital for years. And finally, after some time, my mom recovered enough to lead a normal life. We were grateful to the man. After that, we cooperated and began to act to fulfill the man's request. I snapped back to reality. I was suddenly recalling something from the past. I have to focus on my work. With that thought, I briskly continue processing. After guiding a group of tourists, I took a break. Isn't this place supposed to be a famous hotel? It's not as fancy as I thought. Yeah, right. I expected a more luxurious hotel. Well, maybe it's valuable for poor folks, huh? An impudent couple showed up. Both seemed to be in their 40s, with a few kids trailing behind them. They seemed like a family. Nothing particularly unusual. But their vulgar way of speaking somehow put me in a bad mood. I proceeded to check in the man, confirming his name. "I'm Ross, James Ross." The man replied curtly. The moment I heard that name, I got goosebumps. James Ross. That's my dad's name. The man who abandoned me and my mother and whom I haven't seen in 17 years. To meet him again in a place like this. and beside him was probably the woman who was his mistress. They must have remarried. Her name was probably Dorothy, and the young boy with the sour face behind them was likely their child. Their resemblance to my dad was undeniable proof. Lastly, a woman carrying a baby walked up. Siblings, perhaps. They were a total of 5. No doubt about it. My dad was here on a trip with his new family. They didn't notice my presence. Of course not. The last time we met was 17 years ago. I was only 3 years old then, and now I'm all grown up. My dad lazily leaned on the counter and said, "Hey, can I eat at the restaurant now? I'm starving." Unfortunately, there are no tables available at the moment. I can make a reservation for you at 12 if you'd like. Lame. Can't you be more flexible? Other luxury hotels accommodate their guests better, you know. Sorry, but there are many group guests today, so we can't do it any earlier. As I refused, Dorothy chimed in. This hotel is so stingy. Whatever. I'll write a bad review that their service sucks. You'll be in trouble if you neglect customers, you know. Saying that, Dorothy laughed loudly. I maintained a smile like a mask, but inside, I was feeling nauseated. They were vulgar people. They hadn't changed a bit since then. No wonder they had easily abandoned my sick mom and young me. I quietly handed them the room key. After a while, as I was working on my computer in the office, my mother in. I hesitated whether to tell her about my dad. But there was no point in hiding it, so I decided to tell her. Mom, actually, Dad was here just now, with his new family. What? My mom was surprised, her eyes widening. I briefly told her about what had just happened. It sounds like he hasn't changed at all. I'm gonna bring some food to their room now, but I'll handle it. You don't have to come, Mom. You don't want to meet them, right? After a moment of thought, my mom firmly replied, I'll go too. But, it's fine. Don't worry. My mom had a resolute look on her face. She seemed to have something in mind. After that, my mom and I went together to greet the family in their room. May I come in? As we opened the door, the family were already drinking beer, completely wasted. Hey, hurry up and bring some food over here. Jeers came flying immediately. My mom stopped me from retorting with her hand and said with a smile, Welcome to our hotel. My name is Maria. It's nice to see such a happy family. Huh, are you? My dad, who was just drinking without looking at us, finally seemed to notice us with my mom's voice. His face showed surprise, but the next moment, he burst into laughter loudly. Well, I can't believe you're still alive. I'm a grandpa now and couldn't be happier. He laughed with a vulgar voice. Then, he continued to introduce the family. Between him and Dorothy, they had a son, Edward, who was already married, and the girl next to him was his wife, Linda. The two of them were still 18 years old. It seemed Edward and Linda were classmates in high school. But because they had a child, they dropped out and got married, my dad proudly explained. The one Linda was holding was their child, in other words, a grandchild for my dad. Apparently, his name was Theo. My dad continued to passionately talk about how he had been leading a good life since he divorced my mom. In contrast, you're living such a pathetic life in this shabby hotel, doing menial jobs. Totally miserable, huh? Perhaps because he was drunk, his baseless fantasies wouldn't stop. I couldn't help but speak up. It's been a while. My dad looked surprised as he glared at me. So, are you Margaret? Wow, what a sight. You two working together in this run-down hotel, getting along. Probably had to borrow money to cover medical bills, huh? It must be tough life paying off debts. He laughed loudly. Dorothy also joined the conversation. Oh, they are James's ex-wife and her unrefined daughter. And like my dad, she burst into laughter. Poor thing, you're so poor, huh? Well, we have money, so we travel to various places like this. Poor people can't even afford to travel, right? Saying that, she laughed heartily. Even though I desperately tried to convince myself that they were guests, my anger wouldn't subside. Just as I was about to retort, at that moment, Margaret, no, remember, they are guests. My mom calmly restrained me. Hey, what are you whispering about over there? Ignoring my dad's heckling, my mom stood firm and faced forward. And then, she said firmly, Let me introduce the 17-year-old family business and my daughter's family. What? I run this hotel. Annual revenue is $10 million. We've come this far thanks to the cooperation of our guests and my daughter's family. Huh. Yes, my mom launched this hotel. She is the general manager. By the way, I'm also a board member. Actually, the man who covered my mom's medical expenses owned real estate. And that's this land. He had an attachment to this land and didn't want to let it go. But just letting it sit there was a waste. So the man asked my mom, who was reluctant to accept payment for medical expenses, "Once you're better, I want you to make use of this land in any way you can." And my mom was able to receive treatment and recover safely. When she thought about how to make use of this land, she came up with the idea of running a hotel. Of course, it was a series of hardships at first. Starting from a small guest house, we struggled to operate it. After much hard work, we finally managed to grow it into a reasonably sized hotel. It has a good reputation and is popular locally, often attracting media attention. During peak seasons, many people visit from distant places. We were leading busy yet fulfilling lives. My mom declares proudly. And these are my new family members. The board member, Margaret, and, "Hey, come over here." My mom called out to a man in work clothes who was walking down the hallway. "Did you call my name? This is William, the executive director. William is Margaret's husband. Nice to meet you." William, greeting my dad without understanding what was going on. "I got married just recently." William is 3 years older than me. When mother, who had been featured in the local newspaper as a talented general manager, William was a university student studying management. He came to interview for this hotel. Impressed by my mom's story, William decided to work here after graduating. Later, William's astute management strategies paid off, and the hotel became even more famous. With his diligent work ethic and sincere personality, William captivated the employees. Of course, I was one of them. When I confessed my feelings to him with courage, William responded to my feelings. And recently, he proposed to me, and we got married. My dad and his family were dumbfounded as they watched us. That's understandable. We, who had been mocked as poor, were now business owners, something they never would have expected. Whatever. Eventually, perhaps overcome with regret, my dad's hand holding the beer bottle was trembling. He glared at us as if he wanted to say something back, but it seemed like no words came to mind. "James, why don't you say anything?" Dorothy prodded my dad. However, he remained silent, sobering up completely. "I'm just as happy as you are, if not more. Having such a wonderful family and a prideful hotel, and always having lovely guests. Compared to that, indulging in luxuries seems like a boring pastime." My mom was beaming. Dorothy could only grind her teeth in response. Following my mom's lead, I spoke with a clear smile. "Please, enjoy your stay." After returning to the office, my mom said matter-of-factly, "If you don't speak up clearly about these things, they'll get carried away." "Yeah, you're right," I nodded. But they exceeded our expectations. As night fell, complaints started pouring in from other guests. It seemed there was a fight between men in the hallway. William went to check, and it turned out to be a dispute between Edward, my dad's son, and another male guest. Apparently, Edward, while looking at his phone, bumped into the male guest. Despite this, Edward not only refused to apologize but also picked a fight. Just when things were getting serious, William intervened and managed to calm the situation down. But that wasn't the end of it. Edward's wife, Linda, left their baby's diapers lying around everywhere without disposing of them properly. Complaints came flooding in again. On top of that, they were trying to take as much food as possible from the buffet and pack it in containers to take back to their room. Even after being warned, they brushed it off. It was unbelievable. They had absolutely no sense of common decency. And it didn't stop even into the night. They kept making noise and disturbing nearby guests, leading to complaints about being unable to sleep. What kind of people were they? Well, there was no helping it anymore. We made a decision. We decided to refuse accommodation for my dad's family starting the next day. Sure, they were guests, but that didn't mean they could do whatever they pleased. We also had a duty to protect other guests. William said, "I'll go talk to them myself." Considering who they are, there might be trouble if you tell them that. It could be dangerous for a woman, so I'll go, he said. However, it seemed even William couldn't handle them. After a while, a sullen faced my dad's family and William came up to the reception counter. William whispered to me, "Sorry, they wouldn't listen. They're not satisfied and demanding to speak to the general manager. My mom hadn't arrived for work yet. It was up to me to handle it. We have the right to protect other guests. Could you please check out?" I said as politely as possible, but it was clear they weren't satisfied. My dad and Dorothy were whispering something to each other. Then, their displeased expressions turned into smirks. I had a bad feeling about this. If you insist on that, fine, we'll leave. But, in exchange, waive the accommodation fee. Huh. Of course, we were supposed to stay for a week originally. But because of your selfish reasons, we're being kicked out after just one night. And you still want to charge us? Huh. I'm almost tempted to ask for compensation instead. I was dumbfounded by my dad's selfish argument. Immediately, Dorothy came to the rescue. Yay, that's right. No matter how much you guys are successful, it's ultimately a customer-oriented business. If you don't comply, we'll write lots of negative reviews on how terrible this hotel is. Right, Edward? Dorothy called out to Edward. Edward said proudly as he took out his smartphone. Yeah, Mom, I'll record a video of this hotel and spread it around. It'll be known as the worst hotel that ignores customers' requests. He started filming us without asking us. Hey, please stop that. If they did something like that, our business wouldn't survive. I panicked. Then, my mom, who had just arrived for work, shouted loudly as she came to the counter. Margaret, I've reported this to the police. Thank you, Mom. To make these selfish people behave, this was the only way after all. Tisk. At the mention of the police, my dad clicked his tongue, and he tried to flee. But it was too late. William and the other employees rushed out and restrained the family all at once. What are you doing? Let go. I looked down coldly at my dad, who was being restrained on the floor and shouting, "You're the lowest of the low. I never thought you could be this pathetic. You're a complete idiot." He wasn't even our guest anymore, let alone my dad. I spoke my mind. What did you say? How dare you talk to your father like that? Father, I've never once considered you as my father. You good for nothing. He mumbled something incoherently in response to my shout. Eventually, the police arrived. The family was taken away. As they left, my mom, who had been calm until now, shouted, "I'm the general manager of this hotel. I won't forgive anyone who unfairly defames the hotel. Go away." The family wore bitter expressions, but they were eventually pushed into the police car. And then, the police car drove away. "Mom, you have such a loud voice. I didn't know you could shout like that," I remarked, and my mom replied calmly, "Of course. After being ridiculed like that, there's no way I could stay silent." And then, she returned to her usual calm expression. "Maria, you're such a great general manager. Just as my grandfather described to me," William casually said. His words caught my attention. "Huh, grandfather?" William shut his mouth immediately. But soon he began to speak. "Well, actually, in the past, my grandfather was hospitalized, and he was taken care of by Maria. So, I've always heard stories about Maria since I was a child. He told me she is an amazing person who gave hope to my grandfather's life. I've always been curious. That's why, when I was a student, I came to interview at this hotel." "What's his name?" William mentioned his grandfather's name. There was no mistake. It was the name of the person who had covered my mom's medical expenses, that benefactor. "Is that true? Why didn't you tell me?" To my bewildered mom, William spoke slowly. "My grandfather hated burdening others with his gratitude. That's why he always asked not to talk too much about himself." "I see." William's grandfather was the one who covered my mother's medical expenses. I couldn't hide my surprise. That's because, originally, William's grandfather had been helped by my mom's devoted nursing care. It's a strange coincidence, but perhaps this is how connections between people work. Later on, my dad's family was arrested. It seemed they had made similar complaints at other hotels and tried to get discounts on their stays. As a result, they had been marked as persons of interest by the police. Moreover, there were still other crimes they had committed. Apparently, my dad had embezzled money from his company and fled. The family had a habit of extravagance. They loved wearing brand name items and indulging in luxury. Ultimately, it seemed to stem from Dorothy's influence, who had been a mistress. Most likely, she had prompted them to embezzle my mom's savings as well. Afterwards, in order to fulfill her desires, my dad had been dipping into the money from the company he had worked for years. Since my dad was the only one in charge of the accounting, he had managed to deceive everyone without being caught until recently. But recently, audits had started at the company. My dad, fearing that the investigation would reach him, quickly resigned from the company. And then, he left with his family. Their story of a trip was a complete lie. It seemed they had been moving from place to place, dodging payment for meals and accommodations. My dad was being sued by his former company, as well as by the hotels and restaurants he had stayed at. Of course, since his family had also been involved in dining and lodging without paying. Dorothy, Edward, and Linda were also arrested. The family ended up entering the jail happily together. However, their grandchildren, Theo, seemed to have been left in the care of Dorothy's parents because he was a baby. Their family had been torn apart, but it was all their own fault. It was the pitiful end of people who had indulged in their desires. From now on, they should carefully reflect on the crimes they committed behind the cold iron bars. And a few months passed. I continued to live my days as usual. No, there is one thing that has changed. It's about time to call it a day. I'll take over the rest of the work. It's not good for you to overdo it. I nodded to William, who smiled kindly. Actually, I'm pregnant now. I'm also going to be a grandma soon. Time flies, doesn't it? My mom said with a smile. By this time next year, I'll also be a mother. It still hasn't sunk in, but there's one thing I've decided. I absolutely don't want to let my child go through a painful childhood like mine. I refuse to let them experience such hardship. I used to envy families who were close. I've always wanted a father who I can rely on. But in reality, I only had such pathetic dad. Well, if that's the case, then I'll just have to let go of that wish. Meeting my dad again this time made me realize that people don't change that easily. While connections with others are indeed important, there are also connections that are better off severed. In my mind, my dad has completely disappeared. I no longer feel a pang of sadness when I see happy families together. Besides, I have my current family. My mom, William, and the baby who will soon be born. I'll cherish them and live on. Right here, in our beloved hotel.